It's great to see folks. Again, for those joining us, if you could just put your name and pronouns in the chat box along with where you're calling from, and then any issues that are really important to you that you're kind of thinking about for the session. Great. We'll get started in just another minute. Great. So wonderful to see so many familiar faces, some new folks. Welcome. Thank you. And we're going to get started in just a minute. Again, if you could just put your name, pronouns in the chat box, where you're calling from. It'd be great to see, to get a sense of who's on the call. Great. Okay. All right. Well, I want to be very conscious of time. So again, if you're just joining, please feel free to put your name and pronouns in the chat box. Also, if any issues that you are focusing on for the session or interested in, please add those to the chat box as well. And we'll go ahead and get started. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I know that folks are just juggling a lot. So we really are just grateful that you took time out to be here tonight. My name is Courtney Chappell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Advocacy Director at Legal Voice. I'm here along with our lobbyists, Ashley Sutton, and our amazing staff, Andrew Kasha, Catherine West, Kim Clark, and Jen Martinez. And we are also so grateful to be joined by Senate Majority Whip Emily Randall, Senator Marco Elias, and Representative-elect Jamila Taylor. So as you probably know, the 2021 session is going to look different. It's going to feel really different. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about what to expect and what the current landscape looks like in Olympia post the November election. We'll also hear directly from legislators about what they're focusing on for the session and how you can get engaged. And then we'll share Legal Voice's legislative priorities, which we're really excited about. So we hope you leave feeling kind of energized about the session, that you can have a better sense of how to plug in, and that you get to know a few of the really awesome legislators who are championing some progressive policies and issues. So again, we encourage you to kind of drop any questions that you have in the chat box throughout the discussion, and we're going to try to monitor them as best as we can and answer them throughout the evening. And we're aiming to finish up no later than 7:30. So before inviting kind of our legislators to chat with us, I wanted to share a little bit about Legal Voice for those who might be new to the organization. So Legal Voice, we were founded over 40 years ago on the belief that all women, girls, and LGBTQ people should be able to live their lives with dignity, safety, and autonomy. We use an intersectional approach to gender justice, where we strive to center the voices of those most impacted. And we're working toward prioritizing racial justice in our advocacy and among our staff, our board, our volunteers. We also use a community lawyering model to achieve systemic change by supporting community groups, coalitions, movements led by and for Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other marginalized communities. So we work across the 5 Pacific Northwest states, Washington, Oregon, Montana, Idaho, and Alaska. And we use 3 strategies to create change and to build community power. Those are impact litigation, legislative advocacy, and public education. So our theory of change, if you can go to the next slide, Jen, that'd be great. Our theory of change is threefold. First, we take cases that will have a broad impact on people's lives. And at the end of last year, we changed our case selection criteria to make sure that we're evaluating case requests through a race equity lens. Second, we draft and we advocate for state and local policies that promote equity. And we do that in partnership with community groups and those most impacted. And then third, we work with community groups on educational materials. In some ways, it doesn't really matter, right? If the law changes, if people aren't really aware of their rights. So we work on a broad range of issues, from reproductive freedom to gender-based violence, LGBTQ rights, and economic justice. We have a staff, I think we're 12 now. Our primary office is in Seattle, and we have 2 rock star staff members in Idaho. We're small, but we're mighty. And then earlier this year, we Sexual Violence Law Center, SVLC, joined us and became a project of Legal Voice. And for those who don't know, SVL provides direct services and technical assistance to domestic violence survivors, sexual assault survivors, and they use a holistic model in their approach. So the next slide, please. So since we were founded, we have created significant changes in the legislature, in the courtrooms, and it's because of that foundation that we are now really ideally positioned to leverage that expertise, those resources, and engage in broader movement building work, systemic and community-led work. We're 2 years deep into our own journey towards becoming an anti-racist organization. A lot of that work has really been internally focused, a lot of staff trainings and retreats. We hired an outside consultant, outside race equity consultant, underwent kind of an organizational-wide DEI assessment. And then recently we adopted a set of race equity values that really focus on honoring the diverse experiences of our staff, of our board, of our partners, again, building community power, making space for meaningful collaboration and relationship building with community, and making sure that we're accountable. Our work isn't and shouldn't be siloed from other movements or community organizing efforts that are happening. So we're really pivoting the way in which we approach our work by ensuring that those most impacted, those who've been historically marginalized, are leading the advocacy and are at the forefront of creating the solutions. Our race equity values have really guided how we set our priorities in the legislature and how we think about our legal work. We've also explicitly adopted a community lawyering model, which goes really hand in hand with our race equity values. The next slide, Jen. And here, this is, just kind of very briefly, community lawyering is really about co-creating solutions that are community-led, community-driven, community-centered. It's also about leadership development, again, building community power, working with those directly impacted to set the agenda, right? And with this community lawyering shift, the work looks different in each bucket area, as well as in Washington versus Idaho versus other states in the Pacific Northwest. It's a process. Our focus really is on right now, our focus really is on building kind of community relationships and trust, acknowledging also that this takes time, right? The switch and pivot kind of takes time. It's ongoing, and our advocacy will be even stronger in the months and years ahead as a result. So that's just a little bit about Legal Voice. I'm going to turn things over to our lobbyist, Ashley Sutton, who's going to share a little bit more about the legislative landscape. And then we will hear directly from our legislators. So Ashley, and Jen, if you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Courtney. My name is Ashley Sutton, and I am the contract lobbyist for Legal Voice. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm going to talk to you about all things legislative in nature. So most of you know that our 2021 legislative session will look drastically different from what we've seen in years past. We know that we're going to have a fully remote session, which means that the amount of workload that the legislature is able to accomplish will be greatly reduced. And so one of the things that they are prioritizing are outlined here, sort of these buckets that if each legislator will make sure they address these certain elements, the COVID, the race equity, the economic recovery, and climate pieces, that will enable those bills to be prioritized because things will be so slow and just the workload overall will be reduced. We also know that the House has put some limits on how many bills the House is able to, or members of the House are able to introduce. In terms of the legislative makeup, The Democrats retained their majority overall, and you see the legislative breakdown in the Senate and in the House. I think two pieces that I would be remiss to not lift up in this conversation are the win in the 23rd Legislative District. We have Rep-elect Simmons, who is the first formerly incarcerated individual to ever be elected to a state legislator. So Washington has made history in that capacity. I just want to give a round of applause to Rep-elect Simmons. So happy for her and happy for the state of Washington. And then over on the Senate side, we have the historic win with Rep-elect Nobles, who is the first African-American to be elected in over 2 decades to the state Senate. So again, I think during this political moment where we've seen sort of the unjust brutality against African-Americans in our communities, it's so refreshing to be able to see this injection of diversity here at home in Washington State. Next slide, please. Great. And finally, I want to say, like, if you go through this presentation tonight and there are certain pieces that really move you, or you're just really eager to get involved, I encourage you to participate in our upcoming lobby day, which is in January. I think one silver lining in having a fully remote legislative session is that we're going to be able to have people who've historically not been able to participate in the legislative process that can't come down to Olympia. They're able to testify from the comfort of their own home. So I think that is one piece that is great in terms of making sure that we incorporate voices that have been left out of the process. So with that, I will go ahead and introduce our legislators that have been so gracious to take time out of their schedule to join us this evening. I will go ahead and start off with Senator Emily Randall from the 26th Legislative District. Thank you for joining us. Why don't we just kick it off, Senator Randall? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what issues you're focusing on this session?
Sure, really happy to be here along with my colleagues, Representative-elect Jamila Taylor and Senator Marco Elias, and all of you this evening to talk about issues that are so essential to all of us. As Ashley mentioned, I'm the senator from the 26th Legislative District. That's on the Kitsap Peninsula. I see my constituents, Marty Bishop and Gina Cabadoo here joining us tonight. And, you know, my community needs are so similar to many of our needs across the state, and they're issues that really drove me to join the Senate in the first place. I chair higher education and workforce development, and as a first-generation college grad, it's really important to me to continue to remove barriers to access and affordability, including this year working on some anti-racism and implicit bias work on all of our college campuses and protecting some of the landmark investments that we made over the last 2 years in financial aid. I also sit on the Health and Long-Term Care Committee, where I served as vice chair for 2 years, and you know, work with Legal Voice and many partners around reproductive health issues. Previously, reproductive health access for all was a great policy that we had the chance to partner together on to get to the finish line to ensure that our trans neighbors are not denied health coverage because of their gender identity, and really shoring up protections for immigrant Washingtonians as well. In healthcare this year, I'll be working on protections for folks who are being impacted by the ever increasing number of hospital mergers in our state. As a resident of an area with only one hospital, I am particularly attuned to the fact that big out-of-state corporations are coming in and buying up hospitals in Washington. Some of them many of them religiously affiliated. But it's not just about, whether or not a religious entity is making our healthcare decisions. It's about whether or not a company who's putting profits before people and employee protections is making those decisions. So we need to get some regulations in there. Also doing some work around continuing education for medical providers and equity curriculum in medical schools, because we've known for a long time, but we know even more now in this year that our medical system is built on structures and scaffolding of racism, just like all the other systems in our country. And we have a lot of work to do to undo that, to make sure that every patient is able to get the care that they need when they need it. So that's a snapshot. Really, really excited to be here and to hear from my other colleagues about the important issues that they're spearheading this year.
Great, thank you, Senator Randall. Next, I'm going to welcome our Rep-elect Jamila Taylor joining us from the 30th LD. Do I have you?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for having me. This is a surreal moment for me. I'm in the baby stages of being a legislator and excited to get to work. I'm part of a very active class of 2021 of folks who are very engaged in community, and we are setting really high standards for ourselves. And we have great mentors in Senator Randall and Senator Marco Lias. And so what I will say is what I'm focusing on is really what I talked about when I was on the campaign trail is COVID. It fits into one of the main buckets. I'm in a district where we were just disproportionately impacted, 49% renters, a lot of women who are out of the workforce and are having challenges returning to the workforce even when the jobs are available. Childcare gap is a key issue for us. And so I want to make sure that I'm looking at resources that, brings equity throughout. And every bill that comes before me, I'm going to have an equity lens. And I'm particularly keen on and aware of how to do that. I know that some legislators don't have that lens and they need to learn it. And so I think that's part of the work that I have to do. I'm working to, work with my peers is to look at the gender lens, look at the equity lens. Yes, we might be Democrats. And some of us, working across the aisle might be Republicans, but there's a lot of peer learning that we can do through our advocacy. And I think that helps everyone, all the residents within the four corners of Washington State. I would say, I'll tell you what my committees that I've been assigned to. I'm very, very excited to serve on the Community and Economic Development Committee. Helps me with broadband access, community development, economic development. I'm going to also serve on the Transportation Committee. And then most importantly for me, I'm going to be the Vice Chair of the Housing, Human Services, and Veterans Committee. So the work there is most near and dear to my heart, and I get to hit the ground running as a freshman legislator, and one who really wants to see how these systems impact each other. So sometimes when you're in upper management or upper leadership, you forget that these systems interplay with each other. So someone who needs housing may need to be in a location where there's access to transportation, and so how these committees intersect with each other is going to be fascinating in how this process unfolds. So I'm hoping Senator Randall and Senator Lias will let me text them on a speed dial when I have questions like, really, how do we work around this? Because there's just a lot of things that happen behind the scenes in a very quick clip. And we want to make sure that, again, we're trying to make decisions in advocacy that doesn't have too many unintended consequences. It's too big for us to fail. We must come together on this.
Thank you, Rep-elect Taylor. And certainly last but not least, we have Senator Lias. Welcome. He's joining us from the 21st Legislative District. Do we have you?
Yes, thank you, Ashley. Excellent.
So oh, great.
Go ahead.
I was just going to lead in with our question. What are the issues that you're focusing on this session, Senator?
Well, I will just start by appreciating the invitation. It is always a pleasure to share space with one of my sheroes, Senator Emily Randall. So it's a delight to be here. And I've had a chance to share the stage with Representative-elect Taylor a few times, and knowing her life story and her passion and her energy, it is just very humbling to share a space with both of you in this conversation. I, like so many Washingtonians, I have been challenged to really think about placing equity first in all that we're doing this session. And so I've challenged myself to apply that equity lens to my work. Some of the issues I'm excited to work on in that space are thinking about equity in our community college system, and how do we make sure that this tremendous pipeline of opportunity that is our community college, community technical college system is equally and equitably available to everyone. And how do we make sure that our colleges reflect our communities, that the staff and faculty and students reflect the beautifully diverse communities that our colleges serve. So I look forward to working with the chair of our higher education committee and with our new colleague, Senator-elect Nobles, on the committee to really think about equity in our CTC system. Also want to reflect that while we face a COVID-19 public health emergency, we also face some other public health emergencies that are in the background. They aren't waiting for us to act, they're just waiting. Among those are the epidemic of gun violence in our communities, the climate emergency that is already beginning to affect our state. So I want to think about what we can do to address those public health emergencies alongside the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I think we all have an obligation to think about criminal justice reform and police accountability. I'm excited to work on one small piece of that and to join as an ally. And I forget it's not an ally, it's I forget the word, but it's like a collaborator that we need to be. We need to be not just an ally, but an advocate for change, and look forward to jumping in on that. And then of course, the LGBTQ community. While we passed reproductive health access for all, we know that it hasn't translated to relevant and culturally competent care for all trans people throughout our state. So we want to continue and look forward to working with Legal Voice to continue to move that issue forward to ensure that the law that's on the books becomes the reality for trans people in our communities.
Thank you for that, Senator Elias. So I'll go ahead and move back to Senator Randall and just pose our next question, which is, how are you navigating the virtual session?
Thanks, Ashley. It's a good question that we've been grappling with this year, how to ensure that we're creating more and better and more meaningful access to our constituents, and how we're able to connect with each other to do the tough work of preparing for legislative session and then actually legislating. I started at the beginning of the interim what I thought was going to be a few weeks replacement for my weekly coffee hours in community by doing weekly Facebook Lives. And after 30 live community conversations on Facebook this interim, we've realized that this is a really good way to connect with folks, and also brings individuals who couldn't get childcare to come to the coffee shop, who couldn't take time off work, or weren't home from their long commute early enough. This is a way for folks to participate and to watch afterwards, and to engage and hear what's going on. And I love that, and I'm excited for that to translate into legislative session, for more folks to be able to participate, particularly folks in the disability community who I work very closely with and who have been advocating for digital access to meetings for quite a long time, and have often been rebuffed by saying it was too hard for us to figure it out. But now, when every able-bodied person also needs to be able to have virtual access, we are able to make that happen. So it's feels like a real win for equity and access for all of us, except for the folks who are still struggling with broadband. So that's a huge priority that we're going to need to make strides in this year. I also co-chair the Joint Legislative Executive Committee on Planning for Aging and Disability Issues. And in that in a committee hearing over the interim, which I co-chair with Rep. Theringer, we had 60 folks sign up to give testimony regarding the DDA and DSHS, that's Division for Developmental Disabilities, and Department of Social and Health Services budget proposals. So we had a lot of individuals who wanted to tell their stories, and the semi-controversial move that Rep. Theringer and I made was to reverse sort with lobbyists at the very bottom of the list. So we had, everyday Washingtonians able to share their stories first. And that was really important for us to make sure that individuals who had taken the time to figure out how to navigate the Zoom system were able to share their stories. Now, the challenge with 60 people signing up is you don't always have time. So we're also looking for ways to kind of prioritize to make sure that we are able to elicit testimony, whether it's written or maybe a video, selfie video, so that we have a chance to hear people's voices, even if we run out of time, because this legislative session, as Senator Elias can speak to, very pointedly, we just don't have as much time with each other. And that's going to be a challenge that we'll continuously navigate.
Thank you, Senator Randall. And Rep-elect Taylor, how are you navigating the virtual session?
I have email. I mean, as a rep-elect, I am not privy to all the things that they're doing to prepare for a digital presence. I do recognize that even in an urban area, I'm having challenges with maintaining high-speed broadband access, and my committee is probably going to address that head on, not just for my area, but also for the whole state. And so there are going to be a lot of challenges that we're going to have to address throughout this whole process. And my hope is that the residents, our community and advocates are going to give us a little grace as we transition. Not everyone is tech savvy, even though, some of us been on the campaign trail all summer long and last year. But this process of living in the world of Zoom, there is fatigue. And so being able to stay engaged and in a moment where in real life, it would be easier for you to step away to, take care of biology, and on Zoom, that might not be the appropriate thing. And so it may affect how we are able to show up as our real selves when folks are giving of their time and their energy. But what I love about this digital access is that we can go to new possibilities, and people who might not otherwise get an opportunity to share their stories. There could be like a prioritization of folks who are outside of the Seattle core. So you can hear voices outside of Seattle and South King County, and places where it's relatively easy to get to Olympia. But there's just a lot of progressive voices that I want to hear that are outside of Western Washington, and that voice has been drowned out by, well, anyways, am I supposed to be political? Because sometimes I forget what I'm supposed to do. Forgive me. So that's what I'm going to ask a lot is, forgiveness, because I have a viewpoint and I want to make sure that my efforts are really helping the whole community. And that means that I have to be a bit pointed sometimes.
Thank you so much, Rep-elect Taylor. And we'll go ahead and move to Senator Elias.
Well, I just want to.
How are you navigating the?
Go ahead. Yeah, thank you. I just want to encourage Rep-elect Taylor. I learned in the very beginning of my service that it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. So just do what is right, and we'll sort it out. I think I appreciate Senator Randall and Rep-elect Taylor's optimism and positive spirit. I also just want to be real that this is going to be just like the pandemic has taken so much from us over the course of this last year. This session is going to be unlike any other. And candidly, it's going to be all the work with a lot of the fun and a lot of the energizing pieces stripped away. I think about working on the floor for 8 or 10 hours and then having a chance to go unwind and catch up with Senator Randall over a glass of wine or over some tots down at one of the local establishments, and all that is stripped away. So we have the hard work. I also think about when we passed, some landmark LGBT legislation, and our LGBT caucus was able to hug each other on the Senate floor and just celebrate and kind of hold that space together. And we won't have that this session. So I think we all put on our stiff upper lip, and there definitely will be opportunities to expand participation that are so exciting, but we also will be losing a lot of the human connection that makes this process work and makes it special. So our team in the Senate is thinking about how do we find that connectivity, but I think we also just need to give ourselves permission to be a little sad about that we all look forward to this pandemic being over. Let's learn the lessons of access and bring those voices into the process. But I also think it's okay in this moment to sometimes say, this sucks, and I wish it wasn't this way, and it is going to be different, and we'll make it work. But there is some sadness to it, and I think we need more self-care and to find those opportunities to take care of ourselves and one another in the work. I also know that our legislative process and our system of government, not just in Washington, but around the country, was built by white men for the protection of other white men. And killing bills and slowing progress is what the white power structure does. And in a virtual setting where we can pass fewer bills, it empowers those worst impulses. And I look forward to working with my colleagues to fight back against that inertia and make sure if we're only going to pass half as many bills, then we better make those bills count twice as much to ensure that we're still advancing justice and equity for folks. So those are some of the things that are on my mind. Sorry to be a little darker, but I think, it's like 6 o'clock at night and it's pitch dark outside. So at some point we have to be real too, that this is a tough moment, and we'll have to work together to get through it together.
Thank you for your candidness, Senator Elias. So we'll go ahead and move over to Senator Randall. What is the best way for community to engage in the process?
So I touched on this a little bit already. I think participating in remote public testimony is going to be really key. And also, even more than ever before, reaching out to your legislators via email, like Rep-elect Taylor said, we all have it. Sign up on the website for alerts for the bills and committees that you're interested in so you know when to testify, and build relationships with the legislative assistants in member offices. I think they're going to play an even bigger role than ever before in making sure that information gets in front of folks at the right time. So tell your personal stories via email, via phone call, whatever mode of communication is easiest and most accessible for you. Reach out and make sure that you know how your members feel, or that your members know how you feel about the issues that are before us. Folks aren't going to be able to find us in the hallway or run into us, in the rotunda as we're walking from building to building. So use those communication channels to participate, and go to the Legal Voice Lobby Day. Advocating together is a great way to grow the volume of your voice.
Thank you. Rep-elect Taylor, do we have you?
Yes, I think I would also add that depending on your legislator, attend their town halls. We're going to have a certain number of town halls throughout the session, so we're going to give you updates on where we are with things. Sometimes having that context. For me in my district, our legislators have a history of going to the Democrat legislative district meeting every month, and so we provide an update in that setting as well. So there'll be multiple opportunities, and I'm hoping to be able to offer some one-on-ones, so like 15-minute Zoom meetings where you can just pop in. It's a slog for me because I will be giving hours of time, but you only have to give the 15 minutes and you get my undivided attention for that amount of time, and it's via Zoom. So you might have your kids on your arm, or you just might want to say hi and get to know me as an individual. So I think we're going to try to find some additional ways. Not everyone wants to go to a coffee shop even before COVID to go meet with somebody, their legislator, but they would love to do a Zoom meeting where they can just have an intimate conversation about the pressing issue that they have, especially when it comes to things that are as critical and private as women's health. I don't want to have that conversation in public.
Thank you, Rep-elect Taylor. And Senator Elias?
Yeah, I would say that there is not a single best way to engage. I think there are many, many pathways, and each of us as citizens and as community members needs to find the pathway that fits our comfort level. I appreciate Rep-elect Taylor lifting up that there's some issues that you might not be ready to jump on a Zoom call and explain face to face. And an email or a voicemail or signing a petition is okay. It's okay to join in with groups to make your voice heard when you're not ready to step up. There are obviously the more personal the engagement, the more that you're able to share yourself and your story, the more you can find that connection with your lawmaker. But you shouldn't view that as an obstacle either. And then I think of democracy as a team sport. I think finding organizations, and we're all here under the banner of Legal Voice, finding organizations that share your core values and giving them your time, your money, your energy are really important ways to engage in the process too. Legal Voice has an expert team on the ground. They can tell you when your voice matters the most and who needs to hear your voice the most. There's 147 lawmakers, and on the issues we care about, a third of the legislature is probably with us already. And so who are those folks in the movable middle that we need to be talking to? Legal Voice can help connect you. And there are other fantastic organizations in the environmental space and in so many other spaces that you can engage with in ways as well. I think the only thing I will say is the only thing you should not do is nothing. This is a moment where each of us has to be engaged in some way, even if it's clicking a petition on change.org or going to a Zoom meeting or going to a town hall, whatever that spectrum is, the issues we face, the challenges we face, and the opposition we will face from entrenched power systems will be so fierce that we can't afford to leave anybody on the sidelines. Everyone needs to be in this with us. And each one should be contributing according to your energy, according to where you're at this moment in your life. I think of Rep-elect Taylor's story and how this is her moment, and maybe 20 years ago wasn't her moment. And the same in my story, this is my moment, maybe it wasn't at a different point in our life. So each of us brings who we are, and we come to this moment with what we've got, and each of us should contribute in whichever way we can to build a more just future for our state.
Thank you, Senator Elias. I feel ready to go for legislative session now after that pep talk from you all. So I will pose my final question that we have here from Legal Voice to all of you, which is, what are you most excited about or looking forward to in this next virtual session? And why don't we change up our order and just let's have our legislators popcorn it.
Well, I will just start, and I'm most excited about the new faces and new voices that are coming to the process. And Rep-elect Taylor in my community, we've got Rep-elect April Berg, we've got Senator-elect Twana Nobles. For the first time in my experience in the legislature, beginning in 2018 and again now in 2020, the legislature is actually beginning to look like the communities that we represent. And I just see the amazing impacts that folks like Senator Randall and Senator Wen and Senator Doss have had on our process and how the Senate works. I know that bringing in more diverse perspectives, bringing in younger voices from the LGBTQ community, voices from Black, Indigenous, people of color communities is only going to make our process better and more open and really help us address difficult issues with different solutions that we weren't looking for or aware of in the past. So I'm excited for that. I just wish we could all be in the same room so we could really get that energy, and we will in 2022. But I'm excited at the new voices and new faces and new perspectives that are part of the dialogue like never before.
I'll go next. I'm excited about approaching things for the purpose of new possibilities. I am not trying to go to new normal because the old normal wasn't good enough and it really didn't help our community. This is one reason why we're here. And so I'm looking forward to getting to know my colleagues and how to be an effective legislator, and helping folks in the community see how leadership can show up in different ways. Because I'm an attorney, and yes, I have some level of formality from being in the court system, but I'm also a very informal person because that kind of breaks down barriers in building connections with people. So new possibilities and ways of connecting with my colleagues and connecting with community. I think on the campaign trail, because I was in a total digital platform, I connected with people I never would have imagined. So yes, I would love to be on the floor with everyone. I don't know what it's like to, so I'm going to own this virtual space and then see the being in person as a value add and really can enhance the relationships that I think I'm building meaningfully out here in the field.
Wonderful. So, Marco and Jamila have both shared about the equity lens and the importance of new voices. So those are things that I'm really excited about this year too. But one in particular personification of that equity lens is the exciting bill that I'm bringing back alongside Legal Voice again this biennium to extend postpartum Medicaid coverage to folks from 60 days to a year. And bills like that, and like some of the policies that Senator Elias and Rep-elect Taylor are working on, are policies that we're going to really examine with an equity lens and make progress to expanding resources to communities who have long been forgotten, to make sure we're centering the voices of folks who will be impacted in the testimony and in the bill drafting, to make sure that folks are at the table using that community lawyering model that Legal Voice is so committed to bringing personal stories. And I could not be more excited to work with this incredible team of legislators and advocates like all of you to push us forward in a big way in a tough year. Now is the time for us to be making this progress, and it's going to be hard and it's going to be different, and every day will bring a new challenge, but it's worth it. And I can't wait to sine die together and look back at all we've been able to accomplish.
Great, thank you so much, Senator Randall. And let's just all take a moment and give our wonderful legislators that took time out of their schedule to join us tonight and share their perspective on the upcoming session. I feel so confident to have them at the helm and to be under their leadership. Let's go ahead and move to, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Courtney, who will be discussing some of Legal Voice's priority.
Great, thank you. And yes, Senator Randall, Rep-elect Taylor, Senator Elias, it was just so great to get your perspective and hear your thoughts about the session and also the issues that you're focusing on. I think we're also really excited as well for the session to take place, even if it's going to be a little bit different. So we know that you all are very busy, so we welcome you to stay, but Senator Randall, Senator Elias, Rep-elect Taylor, if you need to hop off, it's totally fine. You're juggling a lot of meetings and you have some full days. So again, thank you so much for being here. So now we're going to launch into a preview of Legal Voice's priority issues for the session. This is going to be kind of a sort of a high-level overview. Most, if not all, of these bills are kind of still being finalized in terms of language, and we're still seeking kind of community feedback and stakeholder feedback. But generally, our priorities fall into these 4 bucket areas. The first is standing with workers, especially those in low-wage industries, by expanding critical safety net programs and addressing sexual harassment. The second is ensuring that all Washingtonians have access to the full range of reproductive and maternal health care. The third is around advancing trans equality in healthcare. And then finally, we're supporting policies that have a racial justice focus. So I'm going to invite our program team to share these issues in more detail. And again, if you have some questions to ask, please put them in the chat box, and we're going to do our best to kind of address them as we go through our presentation. So I'm going to invite Andrew to kick us off and talk a little bit about the economic justice work.
Great. Thanks, Courtney. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Kashyap, and I use he, him, his pronouns. And I'm an attorney focused on our economic justice work, which means I'm focused on low-wage industries that women and LGBTQ workers are concentrated in, like domestic work, restaurant work, farm work, and the policy issues that affect those workers. And I'm going to talk about two of our economic justice legislative priorities that Courtney mentioned. One is a bill seeking unemployment insurance for undocumented workers and other ineligible immigrant workers. And the other is an initiative focused on combating sexual harassment among farm workers. So first, I'll talk about the unemployment insurance bill. And first off, I just want to lay the community context for this effort to connect it to our community lawyering values that Courtney mentioned, of ensuring that our legal work is community driven. So this bill is part of a larger coalition effort that emerged during the early days of the COVID crisis. Community groups started talking to each other about concern for the exclusion of undocumented people from COVID economic relief programs. And before long, there was a big coalition of immigrant, worker, social service, and many other organizations that had been formed. And a total of 430 organizations joined together. And the groups got to work on this advocacy effort. And some of the core groups in that coalition include the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, and they're really the lead and convening group. And they're an amazing organization that's immigrant-led and that focuses on immigrant policy and relief work as well as direct action. Some of the other groups include the Washington Dream Coalition, One America, the Northwest Immigrants' Rights Project, Fair Work Center, Asian Counseling and Referral Service, and then us, Legal Voice. So turning to the policy work, as I mentioned, the coalition formed over the exclusion of undocumented families from pandemic-related relief programs. And one of those programs being the federal stimulus program that provided $1,200 per adult and $500 per child. So undocumented children were also excluded. And unemployment insurance was the other major program. So between those two programs, what a documented family versus an undocumented family received to help them through the crisis was huge. In May, the estimate was that undocumented families, which are a population of 270,000 in Washington, that they'd missed out on $600 million. That was back in May. So in this light, the coalition launched a two-part strategy. The first was an immediate relief fund of $100 million. We're trying to advocate for that. And the other was to pass this unemployment insurance bill at the state level. And on the first step, the Immigrant Relief Fund, we were successful through advocacy with the governor's office. As you may have heard, we established a $40 million fund, not the $100 million we hoped for. And that fund ran from late October to early December. It just ended last week, applying for it. And approximately 40,000 people were funded with $1,000 per person as the fund benefit. But there were 50,000 applicants that were eligible and that we could not fund with that fund because it ran out. So that was the unmet need of $50 million that we've left to give a sense of the community need. And so that unmet need leads to this next step of the unemployment bill for the 2021 session. And just to step back for a second and look at that injustice and the exclusion of undocumented workers from unemployment insurance, undocumented workers are working across the economy. Many are essential workers in the service economy, as we know. And as they work, a deep injustice that this bill would help rectify is that many of these workers are paying into the unemployment insurance system to keep that system solvent for the rest, or for other Washingtonians. So in the past 10 years, undocumented workers in Washington have paid $400 million into the Washington Unemployment Fund, and they get none of that back when they're unemployed, unlike other Washington residents. So just to give a sense too of how vital unemployment insurance has been during the pandemic, by September, Washington State had paid out $10 billion in unemployment insurance to Washington residents. So yet undocumented families have had access to no access to this key benefit. So, and that's because of the longstanding federal law that excludes undocumented workers from unemployment insurance. So we aim to pass a state law to work around this federal law exclusion. Our long-term strategy is to eventually pass a permanent bill to provide unemployment insurance to undocumented and other immigrants who are not eligible for unemployment in Washington. But to start with, we're seeking a temporary bill that would pay a flat rate of approximately $350 to $500 per week for a shortened period and for persons unemployed due to the COVID crisis. And the bill would have a cost of anywhere from $100 million to $400 million, ending depending on the number of weeks that we're able to cover. So in this way, we're able to provide some measure of justice for the exclusion of undocumented workers from this key benefit. And in terms of our racial justice values, the coalition is made up of groups led by immigrants of color. Leadership of directly impacted people is a key principle guiding the coalition's work, which reflects the leadership of the Immigrant Solidarity Network that I mentioned. So to wrap this up, this part, it's going to be a difficult bill to pass given the price tag and the current anti-immigrant climate. And we're going to need your support in getting this bill passed through the legislature. So please keep an eye out for this bill amidst our legislative updates. And now turning to our efforts to combat sexual harassment experienced by farm workers, especially farm worker women. Here we're providing legal support to a coalition to eliminate farm worker sexual harassment that's comprised of advocates and Latinx farm workers from Central and Western Washington. And just to lay some of the context, while farm workers are providing healthy food for all of us and fueling the $49 billion agriculture industry in Washington, they're too often being forced to work in unsafe conditions, which is to say that COVID has highlighted the longstanding neglect of farm worker health and safety that's been going on for decades and that sexual harassment is a part of. And we've seen this neglect in how the workers in the packing warehouses of Central Washington were treated during the pandemic, have been treated, not provided masks or social distancing, as well as workers in the fields without adequate social distancing or access to testing. Workers in both contexts began getting sick in large numbers. Some tragically have died, as we know. So turning to zero in on farm worker sexual harassment, it's another health and safety issue that is long neglected by the growers and not adequately enforced by the state through its anti-discrimination law. So power imbalances that farm worker women face on the job lead to extremely high rates of harassment, including sexual violence. Studies show that the rates are as high as 80% in that industry. And at rates that high, sexual harassment has been classified as an occupational hazard in the agricultural industry by researchers. So, and COVID exacerbates this situation as desperate economic times make farm worker women more vulnerable to harassment due to the fear of losing their jobs. So partnering with the coalition, Legal Voice is looking at new policy strategies to intervene on this seemingly unmovable pattern of exploitation, and access to good training has been a focus of the coalition from the start. That's what farm worker members of the coalition from Central Washington have been recommending, not that training is a panacea in any way or a standalone strategy at all, but it's what the farm worker women in the coalition have recommended as a start, as too often they're getting trained by, the bad harassing supervisor or the disinterested human relations department as a default. So we've looked at the Janitors Union in California. They have a great model. They've been national leaders in sexual harassment policy advocacy. They have implemented a peer training system through legislation. And it's a strategy approach that is saying, who better to conduct the training than trained peers who really know the industry and who know what harassment looks like in the industry and can provide culturally relevant training. So that's for the strategy. That's the strategy the coalition is pursuing through a budget proviso. That's the idea here as a first step approach to show the effectiveness of this peer training model. And a proviso just means language in a state budget item that places conditions and limitations on the use of the funds. So our proviso might say something to the effect of $150,000 over 2 years for the purposes of building this peer sexual harassment training initiative with farm workers in Central Washington. And it's proviso one way to make progress towards a larger piece of legislation you're hoping to pass in the future. So overall, the proviso fits into this long-term strategy to show peer training as a best practice and then in the future bring a bill similar to California that would support a larger peer training models and new way to combat entrenched harassment in the industry. So, so we'll keep folks updated on that effort during the session. And yeah, I think I'll close there. Sorry if I was going too fast.
That's great. Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to invite Kim up next to talk about some of our repro work or repro bills.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. If you're like us, you're probably experiencing some Zoom fatigue. So we really appreciate your sharing your evening with you. My name is Kim Clark, and I am an attorney at Legal Voice. My focus area is reproductive rights, health, and justice. And I would say that our policy work in reproductive rights, health, and justice is sort of focused it sort of has two related areas of focus this session. The first, as always, is the need to protect access to reproductive and maternal health care. Here we sit in the middle of a global pandemic that has really laid bare the consequences of systemic racism. And pregnant people are especially vulnerable to complications from COVID. And at the same time, even before the COVID pandemic, we were facing a crisis in maternal mortality that, obviously the data reveals is impacting communities of color, drastically more than others. There are huge disparities in maternal mortality and morbidity among women of color of all backgrounds. And at the same time, access to healthcare is very much under attack at the federal level. I mean, you'd think at this point in time, there would be tremendous emphasis on addressing these inequities, and instead, for the past 4 years, the access to reproductive and maternal health care has been very much under attack. And that's continued even during the COVID pandemic and continues even today. The Trump administration continues to engage in rulemaking to undermine access to healthcare and to bind the next administration to some really bad rules. Our second area of focus is shoring up protections against refusals to provide care for reasons other than, for reasons that are not grounded in medicine, but are grounded in instead in ideology. So with that said, I want to talk specifically about, Senator Randall mentioned the postpartum bill. Was on the prior slide, Courtney? Sorry, I may have. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And so one of the bills that we'll be working on is supporting expanding Medicaid coverage from 60 days to 12 months postpartum. In addition to expanding this coverage, the bill would allow folks to apply at any point within the year. And if at any time they receive coverage, notwithstanding whether or not their income changes, they would be covered for the full year. And the bill also requires that the Department of Health provide, the Healthcare Authority provide culturally and linguistically accessible community education and outreach to ensure that folks are aware of their ability to access the program, because pregnancy medical in general is an unutilized or an underutilized program. Why is this bill necessary? We all know, obviously, that medical needs associated with pregnancy continue beyond 60 days postpartum. And it's at that point that there's a big gap in coverage for people who, either for people because of immigration status, or because they would not meet the income threshold for Medicaid and can't purchase coverage through the marketplace, wind up going without comprehensive coverage. And again, obviously, this is particularly problematic right now in the middle of this global pandemic, and as we're trying to address this crisis in maternal mortality. The community organizations that, or the organizations that are also involved in supporting this bill are Paragi, ACOG, and NOLA. The bill is also supported by a broader BIPOC coalition led by the Maternal Coalition. Okay, I'm moving on to the Protecting Pregnant Patients Act. So this is a bill that provides that healthcare entities may not prohibit providers from providing services related to complications of pregnancy, including miscarriage management and treatment for ectopic pregnancy, where failure to provide care could pose a serious risk to the patient's life or health. The bill also creates a civil cause of action for anyone who, has been aggrieved by a violation of the bill. It requires that the healthcare entities notify providers at the time of employment of their rights to provide this care. And it also imposes certain requirements on the Department of Health to inform providers of the requirements of the act. And why is this act necessary? Again, there is a growing concern about providers refusing to provide certain types of care based on ideology rather than medical necessity or medicine, specifically reproductive health care, gender affirming care, and end of life care, among other things. Obviously, in the case of miscarriage management or care for ectopic pregnancies, that delay can be life-threatening and has been here in the state of Washington. And in fact, the problem is especially pronounced here in Washington. As Senator Randall was saying, as we've seen a drastic increase in hospital consolidations. And the problem is also especially pronounced in rural areas. So we really want to make sure that folks throughout the state have access to these critical services. And then our final, the final bill that we're working on is a hospital oversight bill, which would require the Attorney General's office or give the Attorney General's office and the Department of Health the power to review and approve proposed hospital mergers, acquisitions, or other change of control arrangements, regardless of whether or not the hospital, it's a nonprofit or for-profit hospital system. And it would require that, or provide that approval could only be granted if the acquisition would not detrimentally affect the continued existence of accessible, affordable care that's responsive to the needs of the community. The bill addresses the provision of all healthcare services, but it also specifically calls out certain types of services. Again, the services I mentioned earlier: access to reproductive health care, end of life care, and gender affirming care. So what this does is it gives the Attorney General's office and the Department of Health the ability to review any proposed merger transaction to ensure that it won't result in a reduction in those services in particular communities. To facilitate this review, the bill would require that the parties to the proposed acquisition submit certain information to the state, and in some instances would require that the Department of Health prepare what's called a healthcare impact statement, which would be public. It includes public notice and public hearing requirements that must be made available in languages other than English to ensure that the public has the ability to participate in this process. It allows the Attorney General to recommend disapproving of an acquisition due to its anti-competitive effects, as well as if the merger or transaction will result in a diminution of the types of services that I talked about. It also builds upon pre-existing monitoring and compliance provisions to enable the Department of Health to ensure that completed acquisitions continue to comply with what they said they were going to, with the requirements for at least 10 years. And it allows for various remedies in the case of non-compliance. So that's really a way of ensuring that the types of merger transactions that we're seeing don't result in huge parts of the state having very little to no access to certain types of healthcare services. And the organizations that are working on that bill principally are the ACLU, Legal Voice, NARAL, ACOG, and Planned Parenthood. And then, of course, the state agencies that would be involved in the process are also reviewing those bills. So those are our areas of focus in reproductive rights, health, and justice.
Great, thanks, Kim. All right, so we're gonna have Catherine West come up and talk about kind of our trans healthcare bill and some of the other racial justice policies that we are supporting. Catherine?
Thank you, Courtney. Jen, if you would go to the next slide, please. And my name is Catherine West. I use she, her pronouns. I work in a couple different subject areas at Legal Voice. One is LGBTQ rights. Another is family law, gender-based violence, and campus sexual assault. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. Thank you for your engagement. And I hope you enjoyed hearing from the senators and representative-elect this evening, as I did. I'm so happy to tell you about a trans healthcare bill. Senator Elias referenced it. We are in conversation with him about it, as well as Representative Macri, because really it's an extension of legislation that Representative Macri sponsored and the legislature passed in 2019. And that made it unlawful to discriminate in the provision of healthcare insurance for trans and non-binary individuals. So we know that a lot of trans and non-binary people report negative outcomes when going to healthcare providers. And in addition to that, they also report the lack of coverage available for the healthcare services that they need. And those services are sometimes different. I mean, of course, they also need healthcare services just like for general screenings, but also have very specific trans healthcare needs. And so sometimes insurers consider those to be cosmetic and therefore exclude coverage for those services. So Representative Macri, again, passed a bill 2019, and we're still hearing from the community that these services are still not being appropriately covered. So as a result of that, and we're reviewing complaints to the Office of Insurance Commissioner, we are proposing legislation that would create a cause of action so that an individual could sue their insurer if their trans healthcare needs are not met and based on a discriminatory reason. So again, very excited to be working on this bill. We've been in talks with lots of community organizations about this, including Ingersoll, the Coalition for Inclusive Healthcare. We've also reached out to NAACP, the Black Trans Task Force, just so lots of engagement around this, and there's been a lot of feedback about it. So it's been a beautiful bill that grew up out of the community, and that I have to give credit to the Q Law Foundation for taking this on as a priority and really trying to move it forward. Next slide, please. And then in addition to the trans healthcare bill, I'm excited to get behind two bills that support racial justice. Breaking down the scaffolding, as Senator Randall mentioned of discrimination and racial inequality is and should be a priority for all of us. And so these are some of the ways to start breaking down those unfair systems. The first is eliminating credit scores in determining insurance rates. And it may be a surprise to you, it certainly was a surprise to me to find out that my credit score goes into determining my auto insurance rates, which, you know, certainly just because someone's low income or unable to pay their bills or fallen on hard times shouldn't mean that they're paying higher insurance rates. Our Governor Inslee, issued a report yesterday with equity policies that his office is supporting, and this was included as one of them. And it included a graphic that said, if you have excellent credit, your auto insurance might be around $1,000 a year. If you have good credit, it might be $1,300. And if you have excellent credit, but you also have a DUI on your record, you might pay $1,800. Whereas in contrast, if you just have poor credit, but good driving history, you might pay $2,500. So it's just an example of one of the ways that people have been held back and, you know, been required to pay more and being kept in poverty as a result of that. So we're excited to get behind this legislation. And then the second bill is sponsored by Senator Randall. It is to require health professionals to obtain health equity training once every 4 years. And the training would include topics like implicit bias, as well as how to work with an interpreter, and other skills that medical professionals ought to have when providing care to lots of different kinds of patients from many different backgrounds. We have been seeking feedback from stakeholders about this bill, and someone mentioned that their partners in a nursing program and someone else in the nursing program said that they didn't believe that racial disparities existed or racial inequity existed. And so this is a bill to try and pick away at some of those lack of education or understanding around those issues. And then just to plant a seed for future legislative sessions, we're also working with a group of exotic dancers and sex workers about how to create safer policies for them to be economically secure as well as safe. And so that's just a preview for potentially next legislative session. So thank you again.
Great. Thanks so much, Catherine. I invite folks to drop any questions that they might have in the chat box. We were trying to answer some in real time as they were being posted. And as you can see, for those who know Legal Voice, in the past, we've had our legislative priorities list has been fairly long in some years, but given kind of the scope of this session, the fact that it's virtual, budget constraints, and our shift to community lawyering, that list has really been reduced, and we're really excited about these priorities for the session. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And yes, we can definitely share the slide deck with participants after the presentation. Any questions that folks have? I know we gave you a lot of information. And again, some of these bills are still being finalized in terms of language and sponsorships. So there's a question from Robin, if we are working on any bills regarding sexual violence. Catherine, did you just want to? Sure. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Thanks for that question, Robin. I see you mentioned you joined late, and so the types of bills that the legislature has prioritized are related to COVID, supporting frontline workers, racial justice, and I think climate. I may have missed one, but so at any rate, with regard to your question about sexual violence, you know, we certainly know that people have been, survivors have been in very difficult situations because of the pandemic, and some are staying from home or working from home. We do know that there's a group of folks working to amend or clarify the protection order statutes to create some greater consistency around those statutes. And in addition, there, outside of the legislative context, there is work being done to ensure continued access to the courts for survivors, whether that's through, you know, virtual hearings online or by phone. So those are the things that come to my mind with regard to sexual violence, except Andrew may also want to respond to, again, talk about sexual violence in the workplace. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I mean, I can just mention that our work with farm workers on sexual harassment encompasses sexual violence that they're experiencing in the workplace, and that we've been working with a coalition that really encompasses low-wage industries, including janitors, farm workers, restaurant workers, and hotel workers on those same issues. And that coalition work has been going on for the past 2 years, but this year the other industries, namely hotel and janitors, are pretty decimated by COVID. And so that's why the effort this year is focused on the farm worker industry and the community there. But we have an ongoing effort around sexual harassment, combating sexual harassment among low-wage workers.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Catherine. There's a question from Julia. Can we legislate, and this might be for Kim, can we legislate the parameters of care inside religiously owned hospital systems?
So the Protecting Pregnant Patients Act would apply to religiously owned hospital systems as well as to all other healthcare entities. And what it does is require the entity to allow providers within it to provide medically necessary care, specifically medical miscarriage management care and care for ectopic pregnancies. And so that type of care, you know, the legislature could certainly require entities to provide because it's medically necessary, life-saving care. It's a little more challenging to dictate the specific services that healthcare entities provide. But one of the things that the other bill that we're working on, concerning hospital mergers does, is to ensure that we don't get to a point where there are so many hospital consolidations that there's just nobody providing those services in certain parts of the state. And so we are trying to get to a place where we can ensure that throughout the state of Washington, all Washingtonians have adequate access to all of these services, the full range of reproductive health and maternal care throughout the entire state.
Great, thanks, Kim. There's a question from Judy. What's the process of making Zoom lobbying appointments with legislators, and is the committee schedule out yet so that their offices will know when to schedule? I'm going to ask Ashley if she'd be okay answering that question. Oh, you're on mute, Ashley.
Thank you. Great question. So right now the schedules, I don't believe, are publicly posted, but if you want to drop your name in the chat, I'm happy to share with you the notes I have around committee schedules.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. Are there any other questions that folks have? Great. Okay. And again, we will have more information and updates on our website on all these issues. Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule, busy evening to join us tonight. A couple ways to stay involved, to continue to stay involved with Legal Voice. Sign up for our newsletters. We have legislative specific newsletters as well. If you really want to get into some of the wonky details, and you'll get some updates throughout the session. You can also follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We will be hosting more Facebook Live videos over the year and over the session where we can dig a little bit deeper on some of these issues. So stay tuned for those. As folks have already mentioned, look out for information for our January lobbying training. We really want to be able to provide kind of the more nuts and bolts of the session, how to track a bill, how to lobby, how to testify, kind of the lobbying 101. So keep an eye out for that save the dates. Also, as Senator Randall, Senator Leas, Rep-elect Taylor mentioned, engage with your legislators. Many folks are already scheduling meetings. Representative-elect Taylor talked about the town halls and the Zoom one-on-ones that she's kind of scheduling right now. So take advantage of that when session starts come January 11th. I think it is, it's going to be pretty busy. So if you have time and capacity now, please, reach out to your legislators, let them start educating them on some of these issues that you care deeply about. Then finally, we talked a little bit about this earlier too. Rest. Rest is revolutionary. Catherine put something in the chat box. Rest is self-preservation. And it lets us continue to do this work. This year has been rough, right? We've had a global pandemic, racial justice reckoning, a super contentious and stressful election, and it's definitely taken a toll on all of us physically, mentally, socially. And so we hope everyone is able to step back over the next few weeks and find some space to recenter and practice some self-care. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. It was great to see so many people on the call. Have a great rest of the year, and we will see you in 2021. Good night, everyone.